Most people don't lose discipline in a crisis. They lose it on an ordinary day, when nothing goes wrong, and they quietly decide to do less than they know they should. That decision feels small, but repeated often enough, it changes who you become. This isn't about motivation. Motivation fades, intensity burns out. This is about something deeper, the mental shift that makes discipline automatic. The Stoics understood this. They didn't rely on emotion to act. They trained their mind so action happened even when desire didn't. Because discipline isn't built in moments of strength. It's built in moments of negotiation, when comfort argues and you decide who's in control. In this video, we're breaking down how discipline is quietly lost, how it becomes a habit of avoidance, and how it can be restored, not through force, but through alignment. If you've ever felt like you're capable of more, but can't seem to access it consistently, this is for you. Let's begin. The quiet break. There is a moment almost no one notices. It doesn't arrive with chaos. It doesn't announce itself with loss, failure, or collapse. It slips in quietly, on a random Tuesday, in the middle of an ordinary routine, when nothing looks wrong on the surface. You're doing what you always do, showing up, moving through the day. And then a thought appears, not loud, not dramatic, just a whisper. What's the point? You don't stop when it happens. You don't panic. You don't even argue with it. You keep going. And that's the danger. Because the most destructive thoughts are not the ones that shock you. They're the ones that feel familiar. That single question doesn't feel like giving up. It feels reasonable, almost mature. After all, you're tired. You've tried before. You've been disappointed enough times to justify the doubt. So you let the thought sit. And the moment you stop challenging it, the moment you allow it to stay unanswered, something subtle begins to shift. You still function. You still meet expectations. You still do what's required of you. But something inside loosens. Your urgency dulls. Your standards soften. Your inner edge fades just enough to be unnoticeable at first. The Stoics warned that this is how a mind begins to fracture, not through dramatic failure, not through collapse, but through quiet permission. Permission to lower the bar just this once. Permission to accept effort without meaning. Permission to tolerate a version of life that feels slightly smaller than the one you once envisioned. That permission doesn't feel dangerous. It feels practical. But once it's given, it doesn't leave. It lingers. It shows up the next time you hesitate. The next time discomfort asks something of you. The next time you know you should push and don't. Each time, the resistance feels weaker. The voice of doubt feels more familiar. The idea of effort feels heavier. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, your will begins to thin. You don't stop living. You don't stop moving forward, but you stop moving deliberately. Days blur. Momentum fades. The fire that once drove you becomes something you remember rather than feel. Until one day, you pause, maybe in silence, maybe in exhaustion, maybe staring at nothing in particular, and you realize something is missing. Not happiness, not success, but yourself. And that realization is unsettling because you can't point to one moment where it went wrong. There was no collapse, no obvious mistake, just a slow series of quiet allowances. That is the quiet break. And if it goes unexamined, it becomes the foundation for everything that follows. The invisible anchor. There is a weight many people carry without knowing where it came from. It isn't physical. It doesn't show up on the surface. And it doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly. You feel it when your energy is low, but your life hasn't collapsed. When progress feels heavy, even though nothing is technically wrong. When success doesn't bring relief, only a strange emptiness. This weight isn't created by one mistake. It's created by accumulation. Every time you promised yourself you would do something and didn't. Every time you avoided a hard conversation because it felt uncomfortable. Every time you knew what needed to be done and chose ease instead. None of these moments felt significant on their own. That's why they passed unnoticed. But the mind keeps score. Each small self-betrayal adds weight. Each compromise lowers resistance. Each unkept word weakens trust, not with others, but with yourself. Over time, these moments stack, and eventually, they form an anchor. You don't always feel it dragging you backward. Most days, it just slows you down. You wake up tired without having exerted yourself. You feel unmotivated without being depressed. You sense a dull dissatisfaction that follows you even on good days. This is not burnout, it's not laziness, and it's not lack of potential. It's the quiet burden of unresolved integrity. The Stoics understood that character is not destroyed by catastrophe. It is eroded by tolerance. Tolerance for broken standards. Tolerance for excuses that sounded reasonable. Tolerance for living slightly below what you know you're capable of. And the more familiar that tolerance becomes, the heavier the anchor feels. Eventually, effort itself begins to feel pointless, not because you are incapable, but because your mind has learned not to trust your follow-through. That's when fatigue sets in. Not physical fatigue, existential fatigue. You start conserving energy instead of investing it. You stop committing fully because part of you expects disappointment. You hesitate, not because you're afraid of failing, but because you're tired of carrying the weight of unfinished intention. This is the danger of the invisible anchor. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break you suddenly. It simply convinces you to live with less urgency, less conviction, less fire. And if it remains unexamined, it quietly reshapes your identity. You don't think of yourself as someone who finishes, someone who follows through, someone who can be trusted by their own word. Not because you consciously chose that identity, but because the anchor trained you into it. And until that weight is named, it will continue pulling beneath the surface, subtly determining how much effort you believe is worth giving. Permission to settle. No one wakes up defeated. Defeat doesn't arrive as a collapse. It doesn't announce itself as failure. It arrives through permission. Permission to let something slide. Permission to delay what feels uncomfortable. Permission to say later instead of now. At first, it feels harmless. You tell yourself you'll get back to it, that today was heavy, that tomorrow will be better. And maybe it will. But what matters isn't the excuse, it's the repetition. Because every time you choose avoidance over action, you're not just skipping a task, you're training your mind. One skipped workout doesn't weaken you, but the story you tell yourself afterward does. One avoided conversation doesn't change your life, but the habit of silence does. One broken promise doesn't define you, but repeatedly breaking your own word reshapes how you see yourself. This is how permission turns into pattern. The Stoics understood this deeply. They warned that habits shape character more reliably than intention. You don't become who you want to be by knowing better. You become who you are by doing or not doing consistently, and the mind adapts quickly. When you allow yourself to step back once, stepping back again feels easier. Resistance fades, standards soften, effort begins to feel optional. Not because you've become weaker, but because you've taught your nervous system that discomfort is negotiable. Over time, you stop questioning that negotiation. You begin accepting explanations you would once have rejected. You tolerate levels of effort that would have frustrated you before. You settle, not consciously, but incrementally. And settling doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like being realistic. But realism without self-honesty is just resignation in disguise. Marcus Aurelius warned against this drift when he wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Urgency wasn't meant to create panic. It was meant to prevent decay. Because the longer you live below your standards, the more normal it feels. And once that becomes normal, your identity quietly adjusts to match it. You don't stop wanting more. You just stop believing it's worth the effort. That's when life becomes smaller, not because opportunities vanish, but because your willingness to meet them does. This is the cost of permission, not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the harder it becomes to remember what strength once felt like. The weight you don't see. There is a heaviness many people carry without ever naming it. Not the obvious kind, not stress you can point to, not pain you can explain. It's quieter than that. It shows up as fatigue without effort, emptiness after achievement, a strange sense that something is missing even when things look fine. And because it has no clear source, people assume it's normal. They blame work, they blame age, they blame circumstances. But the weight isn't coming from what you're doing, it's coming from what you didn't do. Every time you knew what was right and chose comfort instead, something stayed behind. Every time you avoided a difficult truth, postponed a necessary decision, or stayed silent when you should have spoken, the mind recorded it, not as guilt, but as memory. The Stoics believe the soul keeps score, even when the mind pretends it doesn't. You may forget the moment, but your nervous system remembers the pattern. That's why the weight feels cumulative. One compromise doesn't crush you, but 1,000 small betrayals stack quietly. And over time, they form an anchor. You still move forward, but everything feels heavier. You try harder to focus, but your attention slips. You rest more, but you never feel restored. Because the exhaustion isn't physical, it's the fatigue of carrying unresolved self-knowledge. Deep down, you know where you lowered your standards. You know which versions of yourself you abandoned, and the mind doesn't punish you for it. It burdens you. That burden doesn't scream, it hums, a low-level tension that follows you into quiet moments, a dull ache that surfaces when the noise fades. This is why distraction becomes addictive, not because it's pleasurable, but because it numbs awareness. As long as the mind is occupied, it doesn't have to feel the weight. But the moment stillness arrives, the anchor pulls again, and you feel it, not as regret, but as distance from yourself. The longer this goes on, the more people mistake heaviness for identity. They say, "That's just how I am. I'm not built for discipline. I don't have that drive anymore." but what they're really feeling is the cost of unfinished integrity. The Stoics never saw this as punishment. They saw it as signal, a reminder that the self is not infinitely flexible, that you cannot abandon your standards repeatedly without paying a psychological price. And the price is not collapse, it's dullness. Life loses sharpness, joy feels muted, purpose feels abstract, not because it's gone, but because it's buried under weight that was never meant to be carried this long. That weight doesn't require therapy to remove. It requires honesty, not dramatic change, but precise correction. And that correction begins the moment you stop pretending the anchor isn't there, the story you accept. The most dangerous part of this process is not the weight itself, it's the story you attach to it. When effort begins to feel heavy, when momentum fades, the mind looks for an explanation. And if you don't choose one consciously, it will choose one for you. You start telling yourself that this is just who you are now, that your energy changed, that your circumstances hardened you, that your limits were always here, you just didn't see them before. These explanations feel comforting because they remove responsibility. If this is your nature, there's nothing left to fix. But that belief is not truth, it's accommodation. The Stoics warned against confusing familiarity with reality. Just because a state feels permanent doesn't mean it is. What you're experiencing isn't a lack of ability. It's a mind that has learned to expect less from itself. And once expectation drops, behavior follows. You stop aiming high because high effort no longer feels justified. You lower standards because enforcing them feels exhausting. And gradually, the story solidifies. You don't think of yourself as disciplined anymore, or focused, or capable of sustained effort. Not because you tested yourself and failed, but because you stopped testing yourself at all. This is how identity erodes, not through proof, but through assumption. The mind mistakes repetition for truth. If you hesitate often enough, you become someone who hesitates. If you avoid discomfort long enough, you become someone who needs ease. And once that label settles in, every future decision passes through it. Opportunities feel heavier, challenges feel personal, growth feels unrealistic. Not because it is, but because the story says so. Marcus Aurelius warned, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." But that only applies when you don't reinterpret resistance as identity. The moment difficulty becomes evidence of who you are, you stop seeing it as something to move through. You see it as confirmation. And confirmation is dangerous because it feels settled. At that point, you're no longer deciding how to live. You're defending a narrative, and that narrative was never proven, only repeated. The weight doesn't trap you. The meaning you assign to it does. Once you believe you are limited, you begin acting in alignment with that belief. Not consciously, automatically. And the longer that loop runs, the harder it becomes to remember that the story was optional. The point of interruption. There is a moment when this pattern can still be stopped. Not dramatically, not with a breakthrough, but with interruption. Most people wait for motivation to return. They wait to feel ready. They wait for clarity, confidence, or energy. But none of those arrive on their own. What arrives first is awareness, a quiet recognition that something is no longer aligned. You notice the gap between who you are now and who you know you're capable of being. That awareness doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels uncomfortable because it removes excuses. You can no longer pretend the weight came from nowhere. You can no longer blame circumstance entirely. You see the pattern, and now you're part of it. This is the point of interruption, not action yet, but honesty. The Stoics believed self-command begins with perception. Before discipline, there must be clarity. You start asking better questions. Where have I been negotiating with myself? Where have I chosen ease over alignment? Where have I been avoiding discomfort and calling it patience? These questions aren't meant to shame. They're meant to locate leverage. Because change doesn't begin where you're weakest. It begins where you've been most dishonest. Once the pattern is visible, it loses some of its power. You start catching yourself in moments that used to pass unnoticed. The pause before avoiding a task. The impulse to delay what matters. The reflex to lower your standard instead of meeting it. That pause is critical. Not because it feels strong, but because it breaks automation. For the first time in a long time, you're not being carried by habit. You're observing it. And observation is the beginning of control. You don't need to overhaul your life here. You don't need intensity or urgency. You need precision. One interrupted pattern is worth more than 10 bursts of motivation. Because it proves something important. You are still choosing. The weight hasn't taken control. The story hasn't solidified completely. There is still space between impulse and action. And in that space, discipline becomes possible again, not as force, but as direction. This is where momentum shifts, not because everything changes at once, but because something stops continuing unchecked. And once that happens, the mind begins to reorganize itself around clarity instead of avoidance. Rebuilding self-trust. Once interruption happens, the next task is not intensity, it's restoration. Because the real damage done wasn't to your ability, it was to your trust in yourself. Every unkept promise weakened that trust. Every delay taught your mind that your word was negotiable, and the mind remembers. So discipline cannot return as force. Force only deepens resistance. It must return as proof, small, precise proof. You rebuild trust the same way it was lost, through repetition. One kept word, one finished task, one standard enforced when it would have been easier to let it slide. At first, these actions feel insignificant. That's expected. Your mind has learned to doubt follow-through. It won't believe change immediately, so you don't try to convince it. You show it. Each time you do what you said you would do, especially when no one is watching, the internal ledger shifts, not emotionally, structurally. You begin closing the gap between intention and behavior, and that gap is where confidence actually lives. Not in motivation, not in affirmations, but in reliability. The Stoics understood this clearly. Self-respect to them was not a feeling, it was the byproduct of alignment. You don't think your way into confidence, you act your way into it. That's why consistency matters more than scale. A small act completed is more powerful than a grand plan abandoned, because each completion restores credibility between you and your own mind. Slowly, something changes. Effort stops feeling pointless, not because it's easy, but because it's trusted again. You stop negotiating with yourself as much. You hesitate less before beginning. You carry less internal friction, not because life improved, but because your inner authority returned. This is what discipline actually is, not restriction, not punishment, but self-leadership, the ability to give direction and follow it. Once that leadership is restored, the anchor loses its grip, not all at once, but steadily. The weight becomes manageable, then lighter, then unnecessary, and what replaces it is not motivation, but stability. You no longer need to hype yourself up. You no longer wait to feel ready. You act because that's who you are again. A person whose word matters. A person whose effort is reliable. A person who doesn't need emotion to grant permission to move. This is the quiet return of strength. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The environment you train in, even with awareness restored and self-trust rebuilding, there is one mistake that quietly pulls people back. They assume discipline is only internal, but the mind does not operate in isolation. It responds to its environment constantly. The Stoics understood this. They didn't rely on willpower alone. They shaped the conditions around them so the right action required less resistance. Because a disciplined mind placed in a chaotic environment will eventually feel friction. Not because it's weak, but because it's human. Your surroundings are always training you. What you see daily, what you allow into your attention, what you tolerate in your schedule, what you normalize in your space. These things quietly vote for or against the standards you're trying to live by. If your environment rewards distraction, discipline feels like effort. If your environment invites comfort, consistency feels unnatural. This is not a moral failure, it's a structural one. The mind follows the path with the least resistance. So if you want discipline to last, you don't rely on force. You reduce friction. You remove unnecessary choices. You simplify decision points. You create cues that guide behavior without emotional negotiation. This is why routines matter, not because they are rigid, but because they remove debate. When action is pre-decided, the mind doesn't need to argue. You don't ask how you feel. You don't assess your energy. You simply move. That simplicity is powerful. The Stoics called this preparation, deciding in advance how you would act before pressure arrived. Not reacting in the moment, but executing what was already chosen. When your environment supports your standards, discipline stops feeling heavy, not because life is easier, but because fewer things compete for control. You're no longer fighting temptation constantly. You're guiding yourself quietly, and that guidance compounds. The fewer decisions you outsource to emotion, the steadier your behavior becomes. Not dramatic, not heroic, just consistent. This is how discipline becomes sustainable, not by becoming stronger every day, but by needing strength less often, by designing a life that quietly pulls you forward even when focus dips and motivation disappears. That is not luck. It is architecture, and architecture determines endurance. Final closing. The return of command. By now, something should be clear. Nothing was taken from you. Not your discipline, not your strength, not your capacity to endure. What was lost was alignment. A series of small permissions slowly widened the distance between who you knew you could be and how you were living. That distance became weight. That weight became a story. And the story began to shape your actions. Not because you were weak, but because repetition trained you that way. You've seen how it happened, not through collapse, but through quiet negotiation, not through failure, but through unchecked patterns. And you've seen where it ends, not with motivation, not with intensity, but with interruption, with awareness precise enough to stop the drift. From there, discipline returns not as force, but as follow-through. One kept word at a time, one standard enforced, one action aligned with intention. That is how self-trust is rebuilt, not loudly, not publicly, but internally, where it matters. This is what strength actually looks like, not aggression, not emotional control through suppression, but self-command. The ability to direct yourself without needing permission from mood, circumstance, or comfort. This is not about becoming relentless, it's about becoming reliable. And once reliability returns, everything else follows. This is NexusMind, where clarity replaces noise, where discipline restores identity, where strength is rebuilt quietly and held. If this path resonates, stay. The work continues.